Hi, my name is Allie Stilwell, and I am a PGY1 pharmacy resident here at the University of Virginia Health System. And today I will be presenting on REMS and regulations. By the end of this presentation, I hope you will be able to describe the FDA regulation of prescription drugs, understand the purpose of REMS programs, and recognize drugs with REMS programs at UVA Health System and requirements associated. This presentation is intended to shed light on REMS programs, but REMS is just one aspect of federal drug regulation. And so I wanted to start with the basics. So what is a drug? The FDCA, or the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, defines a drug as articles recognized in the United States Pharmacopoeia, or USP, the official homeopathic pharmacopoeia, or national formulary. And it actually used to be the case that USP and National Formulary were separate, but back in 1980, these two books were combined, and they now form the official compendium for drug standards in the United States. USP used to specifically contain monographs for active ingredients, and the National Formulary contained monographs for inactive ingredients, but they combined the two. Articles intended for use in diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. And you'll notice here they use the broad term articles, and this is because we're not sure what potential modalities might be used for drug treatment. And then for the last bullet, they specifically defined articles other than food intended to affect structure or function of the body of man or other animals. And this is because if they didn't specifically exclude food, then food would be defined as a drug according to the law. So there's significant history in how we got to where we are today in drug regulation. And so it's important to note that the basis for which the government can regulate drugs is actually stemming from the Constitution's Interstate Commerce Clause. And so you can remember back to like history classes in high school and middle school even. And this is where any commerce with foreign nations or amongst states, whenever you have good or services traveling in between, the government can regulate. And so this is why drugs are included in that. And then the first regulation was as early as 1906 with the Pure Food and Drug Act. And this was actually prompted by the 1906 novel called The Jungle, which actually revealed awful problems with the meat industry and prompted Congress to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act. And this was intended to protect the public welfare. But they still wanted the public to feel like they could make decisions about their health care, and they didn't want to feel like they were controlling it too much. And so essentially what this act prohibited was adulterated or misbranded products, or misbranded drugs. And adulteration you can think of as another word for contamination, and so this is ensuring that a drug is pure. And mainly what this applies to is drug manufacturers and ensuring that the processes in place are forming pure drugs at the end of the manufacture. And then misbranded applies to requiring certain information to be on the label or the labeling. And essentially you cannot lie about what's on a label for a drug. And so these were very simple principles that were first founded in the early 1900s. The next act was not until 1938, and this was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FDCA. And this was the first time that pre-market approval was going to require safety for a drug. And this essentially is the backbone of our federal regulation of drugs today. And we've had subsequent amendments, but it's pretty close to what we have and why we regulate the way we do. The next amendment was the Durham-Humphrey Amendment of 1951. And so until this amendment, all drugs were just one big class. And this amendment proposed that we should have prescription and over-the-counter classifications of drugs. And the reason they identified this was because they felt adequate directions for use was not sufficient for some agents, and that some agents needed medical supervision. And so that is why prescription medications needed to have directions by a prescriber in order to be utilized. And so henceforth, after this time period, there are prescription and over-the-counter drugs. And then lastly, we have the Kufavor-Harris Amendment of 1962. And this came about due to a tragedy that had to do with thalidomide, which was a drug that was being used for patients who were pregnant and were nauseous. And it ended up that there was a huge problem with birth defects. And this product was actually not available in the United States, but it was being used popularly worldwide. And so there was a lot of, it was a huge disaster, essentially. And it prompted Congress to think about safety in a form of whether or not there is a safety issue with if a drug is not effective. And so in this case, the drug wasn't actually effective, and it was causing a huge safety issue. And so it caused them to rethink the idea of efficacy. And so after this amendment, there also had to be adequate proof that a drug is also effective for its use. So it wasn't until 1962 that a drug had to be both safe and effective until it was brought to market. So we all know about the FDA, but just to define their role a little bit more, they are the primary enforcer of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FDCA, and they're a component of the Department of Health and Human Services. Important to note that the FDA does not develop drugs or conduct clinical trials. Essentially, they just provide guidance to drug companies, and then they evaluate the data generated from those programs, and then they determine whether or not a drug can be approved. And then it's interesting, they don't take into account whether or not a drug is better than other drugs out in the market, or even as good as other drugs out on the market. They can certainly take this into consideration, but it is not a part of the burden of proof that manufacturers have to provide. And so the approval is dependent on substantial evidence of effectiveness, and then making sure that the benefit is going to outweigh the risk and potentially remaining uncertainties with the drug. And then the original intent of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was to enforce the adulteration and the misbranding issues, but now we even monitor drugs after approval by means of clinical trials, epidemiologic studies, and post-marketing reports. One thing that I wanted to point out that is important is that just because a product has an NDC number or a National Drug Code number does not mean that it is an FDA-approved drug. So the presence of the NDC number is merely for labeling, and it does not indicate that it has received approval, and it's more for identification and reporting purposes. And we found that this has helped facilitate third-party prescription drug processing for insurance claims, and then for distributing products among different manufacturers, wholesalers, and pharmacy. And so typically the number is 11 digits. The picture I have here is 10, but it accurately depicts the different components of the NDC. And so the first set of numbers is identified by the manufacturer or the distributor, and then the second set of numbers identifies the specific drug, and then the last remaining numbers identifies the package size. And so this has been helpful for reducing medication errors, but as I mentioned, it's just to identify and help report drugs, so I wanted to make that distinction. Before everyone can use a drug, it must be FDA approved. And this new drug approval process is regulated by the FDA, and they determine that a drug is safe and effective for use under the conditions that are outlined in this prescribing in the proposed labeling. And so actually, drugs must also meet rigorous standards of approval for drugs quality and manufacturing processes. And this process is actually very extensive and lengthy, and the time from submission of an application to the FDA's decision can be at least 6 to 12 months. Our first assessment question is, which of the following is the correct definition of a drug? A, articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, or otherwise applied to the human body. B, articles used for food or drink for man or other animals. C, articles intended for use in diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Or D, products that are intended for ingestion and to supplement the diet. And the correct answer is C, articles intended for use in diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. A describes a cosmetic, B describes food, and D describes a dietary supplement. The next few slides depict the actual drug approval process. After there has been extensive preclinical investigations by an investigator through laboratory experimentation and animal testing, and the applicant has determined that this drug is reasonably safe to test in humans, they can pursue IND status, or investigational new drug status. And essentially, this is asking the FDA for permission to test a product clinically in humans. And the purpose of this process is to protect the safety of humans who are going to participate in clinical trials and ensure that those clinical trials are designed appropriately. And oftentimes, it's required that all participants in these trials receive informed consent so that they know exactly what they're signing up for and the risks that come with. The application that comes a part of the investigational new drug status is obviously the name and composition of the drug, methods of manufacture and quality control, information from preclinical, so these would be animal studies, and then investigations regarding pharmacologic, pharmacokinetic, and toxicological evaluations. So how a drug works in the body, how is it absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted. While in the investigational new drug status, there are multiple phases of studies, each with its own purpose. Phase 1 studies look to characterize the toxicity, metabolism, bioavailability, and elimination of a drug. And typically this is a smaller amount of patients, and the purpose is to detect adverse effects. Phase 2 can look at the drug in more patients, and its goal is to determine efficacy, and if efficacy is found, at what dose of the medication is it efficacious. Phase 3 are larger clinical trials that test the drug's safety and efficacy at some proposed dosage. 1 in 10 drugs make it through IND status, and at that point they can file an NDA, or a new drug application. So this can only be done after successful completion of Phase 3 studies, and these applications contain a huge submission of information, so details about the drug chemistry, preclinical studies, the manufacturing process, clinical studies, labeling, and packaging. And as you can imagine, the FDA receives a very large amount of these submissions, and so they prioritize their submissions by a rating system through chemical type and therapeutic potential to help sift their way through all of the applications. After approval, there is a process referred to as post-marketing surveillance, or Phase 4 studies. And this is because the product is now being used in an even bigger number of patients compared to before it was marketed. And so long-term adverse effects may not be discovered prior to approval, but now that we have a bigger sample size, we might discover some untoward effects. And so it used to be that the FDA could only request that these studies be performed by the manufacturers to find additional information. But that changed with legislation called FDAA. So FDAA, or FDAAA, stands for the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act of 2007. And this gave the FDA the power to require Phase 4 testing. And so manufacturers must maintain post-marketing reports and submit to the FDA reports of serious adverse drug reactions and new information relating to safety and efficacy. Also, this act brought about the authorization for the FDA to require risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, or REMS. And this is prompted when it's necessary to ensure that the benefits of a drug outweigh the risk. Just as an aside, FDAA also created MedWatch, and this is the voluntary reporting program, and even the general public can report to this, but pharmacists submit the largest number of adverse drug reactions. And they can also report potential and actual product use errors and then product quality problems. As I mentioned, it's for both healthcare professionals and patients. And as a result of the FDAA, pharmacies must provide patients with a toll-free number so that they can report adverse effects to MedWatch. And in some instances, you might be asked to report on behalf of a patient, so it's good to be aware that this is available and then how to access it. And so if you just Google MedWatch, you'll be forwarded to the FDA's website for MedWatch, and then this will be the first form that you see, and you'll decide whether or not you are a healthcare professional or a consumer/patient. And so you can always describe to the patient how to go about filling this out if they experience an adverse effect. Back to REMS. So it was granted by the Food and Drug Administration, or granted to the Food and Drug Administration by FDA, and they can require a drug product sponsor, so usually the drug company, to establish special procedures directed usually at patient safety. And the purpose is to manage known or potential serious risks of the product. And it can occur at any time in the drug life cycle, so before approval or after approval. And it's not uncommon that it happens after approval because, as I mentioned, then it's being used in a wide variety of patients, and so then a new safety information might emerge after it's been more widely used. If it's discovered pre-approval, then upon implementation of the REMS, it must be fully operational before the drug can be marketed. The FDA uses multiple criteria to determine if REMS are necessary. So the size of the population likely to use the drug, if it might be more important to the FDA if it's going to affect a wide range of patients. Also, the seriousness of the disease. Sometimes the seriousness of the disease might allow for some more risk. You might be willing to accept more risks if the disease is more serious and you have less treatment options. The expected benefit of the drug. So if you're not going to get that much benefit from the drug and it has a very risky side effect profile, then is it even worth it to market the drug? The expected duration of treatment. So obviously the longer the treatment duration, the increased likelihood for a potential risk. Seriousness of the known or potential adverse event. So are we talking about a lab abnormality, or is this more, it can cause death and it's very serious? And then whether the drug is new is also a factor, because if we don't know that much about this active ingredient, then the FDA is going to be a lot more cautious in assigning that risk because there's a lot more unknown. REMS programs affect a lot of parties, so healthcare providers who prescribe, patients who receive the drug, healthcare settings and pharmacies that dispense the drug, and then wholesalers and distributors that make and then provide the drug. And there are many potential REMS requirements. All REMS should include at least one overall goal and then at least one of the following components. And there may be many combinations of these components that can be utilized, but the one required component is a timetable for assessment of the REMS. And then all of the approved REMS documents and the appended materials are posted at the FDA's website, which you can find if you Google REMS at FDA. So for our next assessment question, which of the following is a result of the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act of 2007, which I've been referring to as FDA or the FDAAA? A, drugs must prove safety and efficacy in order to obtain FDA approval. B, post-marketing clinical studies to assess risks. C, ingredient labeling for inactive ingredients. Or D, good manufacturing practices. The correct answer is B. So FDA allowed the FDA to make it mandatory that post-marketing or post-surveillance or phase 4 studies are required to assess risks after a drug product has been approved. A refers to the Kefauver-Harris Amendment. C refers back to the Durham-Humphrey Amendment when they made the classification between prescription drugs and over-the-counter drugs, and over-the-counter drugs needed to have all of the inactive ingredients put in the label so that consumers could make informed decisions. And then good manufacturing practices, this also came out of the Kefauver-Harris Amendment and is meant to establish certain parameters and procedures that drug companies should follow so that that purity is maintained in a product and it does not become adulterated. So I already stated that you don't have to have all of the requirements for the different types of modalities for a REMS program, but here are three that are most commonly used. So the first one are medication guides. And so these are designed for patients and caregivers, and they contain important information about reducing the risk or steps to reduce risk. And they're usually given out, or they should be given out, each time the drug is dispensed. However, this is not necessarily the case in the hospital setting. And so the FDA has weighed in and stated that they exercise enforcement discretion regarding the requirement to provide medication guides in certain settings, such as the inpatient setting. And what they've decided is that what they more care about is that they want the patients to receive important information about the drugs they will be taking, but they don't want to burden the healthcare system by giving out repetitive information. And so unless the materials have changed, this doesn't necessarily need to be given out in the hospital setting. The next one that's commonly utilized is a communication plan, and these are FDA-approved letters or other printed materials that will alert healthcare providers. And then the next one that's also commonly used are elements to assure safe use, or ETASU, and these are interventions or other actions that healthcare providers must take before the drug is prescribed, dispensed, or used. So just to go into each one of those a little bit more, all medication guides must meet standard requirements, but not every newly required medication guide is an element of REMS. And so here is a template for a medication guide, or this would be one that you might see. And this was actually put forth by the FDA as an example, and this is for a long-acting or extended release pain medication, and an example would be like OxyContin. And essentially these contain instructions for patients, signs of potential overdose, and emergency contact instructions, and then advice on safe storage or how to prevent accidental exposure. A little more passive strategy is the communication plan. So this is meant to communicate risk to healthcare professionals, and it's done so through the drug sponsor. And they're also called Dear Healthcare Provider letters. And so basically they educate, inform, and raise awareness of the risk. Then there are more involved components than the communication plan or the medication guide. So these are called elements to assure safe use, or ETASU. And these are interventions or other actions that healthcare providers must take before the drug is prescribed, dispensed, or used. And it may include one or any of the following requirements. So the first one is certifications. So this could be physician certification or specialized training that the physician has to receive before prescribing. Certain healthcare settings, so this might mean that the pharmacy has to register or be specially certified before dispensing. Safe use conditions, they might determine that a drug should only be prescribed while in the hospital, and so a hospital would be the safe use condition. Subject to monitoring, they might decide that certain laboratory tests need to be tested periodically in order for the drug to remain on the market in a safe environment, or registry enrollment. And this is to ensure transparency, and so that everyone will know that a patient is on a drug. And so like I said, it can include one or any or all of these measures. Another component is an implementation system. And so the sponsor may require things to monitor, evaluate, and improve the implementation of the ETASU. And they can do this by a REMS-specific website that helps outline all of the requirements. It could also be through a call center to help facilitate enrollment if patients are needing to register, or if healthcare settings or pharmacies need to obtain certification. It can also be electronic databases to keep a list of all the certified hospitals, as well as the periodic safety monitoring that is being done for these patients, and then certified healthcare settings. And so all of these help carry out the elements to assure safe use. The one required component is the timetable for assessments. And so all REMS programs must include a timetable to assess their effectiveness of their safety measures. And the goal is to determine to what extent the required safety measures of the REMS program are meeting its goals. And so if the assessment shows that things have been changing, then maybe they need to modify the REMS program. If they have met the goals of the REMS program, they might decide to eliminate it altogether. And so they are required to do this periodically, and the FDA has outlined specifically they want these done by 18 months, 3 years, and in the 7 years after the REMS is approved. And as I mentioned, the results can be used to modify or perhaps eliminate the REMS program. And so there's been examples of drugs that have undergone changes. And so Letairis is one. This is used for pulmonary hypertension. And it used to be that we had to monitor liver function tests with this drug. But after they had an assessment, they realized they no longer needed to do this. So they removed that component of the REMS program. And Letairis still has a REMS program for another requirement, but due to this timetable, they were able to assess and realize they no longer needed to do that to ensure the benefit outweighed the risk. And dofetilide is another drug that is used in patients that have heart rhythm issues. That used to be that we had to check that the prescriber was registered, but now it's no longer a REMS program, and so that's no longer a requirement. And so it's good to be mindful that these safety measures aren't always permanent. There are 72 current REMS programs according to the REMS FDA website, which, as I mentioned, anyone can access. So I've identified 17 drugs that we have here at UVA. This slide shows the different components of a REMS program that all of these medications possess. I'm going to go through Adempas as an example, but I also wanted to point out a couple other examples. And so Aved, or testosterone, this can cause a serious lung problem that can lead to an allergic reaction that is as bad as anaphylaxis. And so they have an ATASU that the healthcare setting has to be certified to dispense. Here at UVA, this is non-formulary, but we have the certification to dispense. And there's usually one person or an authorized representative designated to ensuring that the pharmacy has completed the certification process. And the person at UVA is commonly in the Medication Use Policy Division of the Pharmacy Department. And then going away from Aved, if there were some other components, such as making sure that labs had to be followed, the person that's designated to help with following through with the REMS program can help make sure there are parameters built in our electronic medical record system to ensure that all the requirements are being followed. And a lot of the requirements that are ironed out as new REMS programs are initiated are a lot of work, but they don't occur overnight. And so if we were to suddenly add something to formulary that had a REMS program that needed to be, you had to ensure the prescriber was registered, it might be that a pharmacy technician may be asked to look and double check that a prescriber was registered if this was before all of the onboarding processes had been carried out, and in which case you could look at the drug manufacturer's website, or you could contact a call center to obtain that information to see whether or not a prescriber was enrolled or certified. And then another example is Lemtrada, which is restricted to REMS-certified physicians at Emily Kurek Clinical Cancer Center for patients who have relapsing forms of multiple sclerosis, and they have to be registered with the REMS programs. And so we don't allow it to be used outside of these requirements, and that's how we maintain compliance. So at UVA, Adempas is restricted to patients continuing therapy from home for pulmonary hypertension. And the FDA website has all of the resources provided by the manufacturer available in one place, so you don't have to go to different websites to obtain information. And so they've outlined their purpose here. And so they want to inform prescribers, patients, and pharmacists about the serious risk of teratogenicity, as well as safe use conditions for Adempas. And so here is the med guide that is specific to Adempas, which talks about the risk that the REMS program is trying to mitigate. So this would be handed out to a patient. Adempas also has elements to assure safe use. And so healthcare providers who prescribe Adempas need to be specially certified. And pharmacies that dispense Adempas need to be specially certified. And once those requirements have been met, Adempas can be dispensed to females with evidence or other documentation of safe use conditions, and they themselves must be enrolled in the Adempas REMS program. So there's also a step-by-step guide available to ensure compliance. And so here's the wording about having an authorized representative. And so one thing that is notable here is that you can only dispense a 15-day supply, which might be an odd amount. And so as maybe an outpatient pharmacy technician, you might wonder why this is and need to double-check the quantity. But this information is available on the website, and you would understand why it is this way. For our final assessment question, which of the following is an example of elements to assure safe use? A, the drug be dispensed to patients only in certain healthcare settings, such as hospitals. B, healthcare providers who prescribe the drug have particular training or experience or specially certified. C, pharmacies, practitioners, or healthcare settings that dispense the drug are specially certified. Or D, all of the above. And the answer is D. So ETASU can have one or all of the components wrapped into their REMS program. So in conclusion, the FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by assuring safety, effectiveness, quality, and security of drugs. REMS allow drugs that may otherwise not be on the market to remain available. And various elements such as medication guides, communication plans, and elements to assure safe use can be utilized to ensure that the benefits of a drug outweighs the risk. And in fact, the FDA is evaluating how to make REMS programs less burdensome, and the number of REMS programs have actually decreased, and this has led to a lot of programs that have been discontinued. But there are still ongoing assessments about how we do REMS. And so, at this time, I will take any questions.